In a vast, sprawling golden wheat field under a warm, shimmering sky, memories of the past began to unfold. The father was asking his little blonde daughter, Grace, if she remembered the oath of the previous Duke of Taylor she had learned last time. The young girl replied in the affirmative, recalling the oath, stating that no one shall die of hunger in Taylor's lands. The father embraced his daughter, confirming the correctness of her answer, then told her that this was the land she would one day rule. He explained to her that in exchange for owning these vast wheat fields, she must bear the responsibility and duty that come with it, protect the land inherited from her ancestors, and care for her people who placed their trust in them. The father asked her if she understood, and the child answered enthusiastically from between his arms that she would protect the precious lands of Taylor. The warm memory faded, replaced by fragmented scenes of reality, fires devouring crops, men conspiring, and destruction befalling villages. Grace now stands, having become a young woman, behind a large window, watching the horizon with anxiety, the weight of the worries she carries visible on her face. She closes the curtains and walks with slow steps through the dark palace corridor, heading toward her office, which is teeming with documents and important papers that reflect the scale of her responsibilities. As she examines the stacked papers before her, a frown appears on her face, reflecting the heavy burdens placed on her shoulders. Suddenly, her focus was interrupted by the voice of a maid who entered in a panic, calling her, "My lady." Grace stood up calmly to ask about the cause of this commotion. The maid told her there was a big problem, as the young Count Saxon was harassing another maid named Jessie. The Count, a red-haired young man in a clearly drunken state, was shouting angrily at Jessie, who was kneeling on her knees before him. He was rebuking her loudly, asking why she had not sat beside him, and if it was really such a difficult request. The head butler intervened, trying to calm the situation, pleading with the young count to compose himself and leave Jessie alone for the time being. But the count flew into a rage, poured the contents of his glass over the head of the head butler, and then shouted indignantly at how a mere servant dared to speak without permission. He asserted that those like him must only obey their master's orders. At that moment, Grace appeared at the entrance of the room and told Count Saxon with firm calmness that it was late and he must leave. The head butler and the maid were surprised by their lady's appearance and felt relieved. The drunken count turned, initially questioning the identity of the speaker, only to realize it was Grace Taylor. When he recognized her, a cunning look crossed his face. Then he wondered in a low, malicious voice if she was truly worth the price paid. The Count received Grace's presence with irony, noting that his legendary fiancée had finally honored them with her presence, after hiding all this time. Describing the timing of her appearance as perfect, he justified his rude behavior by saying her subordinates were insolent and that he was in the process of disciplining them, adding provocatively that a servant's mistake is the master's responsibility. Then he demanded that she pour him a drink as an apology, and in return he would forgive her servants' insolence. Grace called the head butler and Jessie calmly and told them she would speak with the young count as was proper. Then she asked them to leave, and they reluctantly obeyed her command after a concerned look. Once they were alone, the drunken count approached Grace and muttered a mysterious phrase to the effect that even Taylor has moments when it pays its debts. Count Saxon spoke mockingly about his great family's marriage to the Taylor family, explaining that it made no sense to him. The Taylor family, with its golden wheat fields, was previously known as the Rock of the Empire. But seeing it treated this way would have made her mother and father sad. And Grace added that she might be blamed and they would ask her what she had done to allow Taylor to reach this point. Grace remembered when her relative told her that her parents were now the Duke and Duchess and that the Duce was no longer Grace's home. While the new Duke was announcing that the way the Duce was managed was up to him, he demanded the documents be stamped without further discussion. Grace addressed her parents in her heart, saying that she had lived holding her breath even when things were taken from her repeatedly, and she remained silent. She recalled her promise to her father to protect Taylor and its precious lands. After that, Grace interacted with Count Saxon, who asked her about the matter, and she replied that he was the one who deserved the money. The Count was surprised, saying, "What?" while Grace reminded him that he was still the Empress's nephew and wondered about the terrible behaviors he might have engaged in. Grace explained that it was unusual for the Count's family not to receive a dowry, but rather to offer to pay Taylor's massive debts, and this was what made her understand. Now the Count suffered a panic attack and began to stumble, calling Grace crazy. Then he threw a bottle of wine on the floor, and Grace commented that the crazy Count is the one who flirts with a maid in his wife's land one day before the wedding. The Count ordered Grace to shut up and raised his hand to slap her, but he tripped over the bottle he had thrown on the floor, lost his balance, and fell to the ground. After that, Grace stood holding a wine bottle and spoke to her parents, saying she had something she wanted to add. Count Saxon trembled and asked what. Ben feared she would use the bottle against him. Meanwhile, Grace was preparing to execute her plan, for she had been holding her breath, preparing her blade in silence. Grace announced that the time had come to raise that blade. She warned the Count, saying that if he bit his tongue, he would die, and ordered him to grit his teeth, then delivered a powerful blow to his face with the bottle. Two people on horses arrived at the Taylor house. One asked the other what was in that invitation and why he had come in a hurry from the Wall of Death. The other replied that he was curious to know if the invitation was real or not. The other man reviewed the text of the invitation addressed to Duke Richmond, requesting his presence at her wedding, and promised to be the sharpest sword defending his secret. She mentioned at the end that she was Grace Taylor. After the Count fell to the ground, Grace stood looking at him calmly. Grace was contemplating the situation, realizing that dealing with reality differs from what is expected as she looked at the Count lying before her. Elsewhere, a young woman named Rosette Taylor was showing off her elegant dress and asking her mother and Lady Cornwall for their opinion on her appearance. Lady Cornwall, the senior lady in waiting of the Taylor, praised her daughter's beauty, while her mother, Baroness Emma Ronan, commented that Rosette was already beautiful and did not need to overdo her adornment. Rosette explained that she wanted to dress up to congratulate Grace at her wedding, but her hidden thoughts revealed her gloating as she was actually congratulating her on what she considered a sale deal to the Saxons. Emma Ronan confirmed with a satisfied smile that by Grace's marriage to Jack Saxon, they were completely exempt from all the debts they owed his family. Emma Ronan described this as a happy occasion, expressing her hope that the real Taylor would disappear by tomorrow, and they proudly announced that it would finally become entirely theirs. Back on the wedding day, Grace sat quietly reviewing some papers. Even on her special day, one of her ladies-in-waiting alerted her that it was time to put on the bridal veil, and she quietly agreed. The lady-in-waiting commented that it was unusual for a bride to work until the last moments, but Grace explained that accomplishing everything she could until the end would make things easier for them later. The lady-in-waiting asked her lady with concern if she was okay, then announced the arrival of the Duchess and Lady Rosette. Grace received them, and the Duchess stated that she had come personally to offer some words before the ceremony, considering that she was the one who raised her. The Duchess whispered in Grace's ear, warning her against acting recklessly and bringing shame to their Taylor family name, and ordered her to endure everything, even if her husband brought an illegitimate child or assaulted her. She stressed that she should never think of asking them for help, reminding her of her ability to endure, then ended her speech with cold advice to live well no matter what happened. With a calm smile, Grace replied that she would take her words into consideration. As she left, Rosette muttered angrily, hoping that Grace would live her life smiling like a fool and would never return as one of the Taylor. Even after her death, the two women left, thinking that this was a house that had become their home now. Leaving Grace, standing with her ladies-in-waiting, Grace decided it was time to leave. While looks of concern were visible on the faces of her ladies-in-waiting, Grace was telling herself that this was just the beginning, and that she could not allow her feelings to collapse at this moment, and that the only time she is allowed to cry, and the only right granted to her. Grace thanks her ladies-in-waiting for everything until now. It is the time when she returns as the true Tor in the church. The groom, Jack Saxon, stood with dark bruises on his face, which aroused the surprise of those present and their questions about the cause of those injuries. Rosette whispered to her mother that the rumors about him being a violent man seemed true and that Grace deserved a husband like that. Anger was evident on the Count's parents as they looked at their son's injured face. The Count himself was feeling distressed as he could not remember anything from the night before, and all he felt was a sharp headache. Suddenly he raised his head to see Grace advancing toward him in the aisle. Grace looked extremely beautiful walking in her white wedding dress. One of those present noticed the great resemblance between her and the previous Duke and Duchess, and thought to himself how pathetic she was. The groom was dazzled by Grace's beauty as she stood before him at the altar and could not hide his great admiration. Two of the guests, one of whom was Duke Walter Richmond, noticed that the groom could not take his eyes off the bride, and his companion joked that he might start salivating, so the Duke warned him to mind his words. Even the Archbishop was casting looks of admiration at them, while the groom was still stunned by her beauty. Meanwhile, Duke Richmond remembered the invitation he had received from Grace, in which she offered to place the sharpest blade in his hands to protect his secret if he honored her wedding ceremony with his presence. She had promised in her invitation that this blade would be the most useful weapon in the hunt he had prepared for, and it bore the signature of Grace Taylor. The Duke wondered to himself how such a woman who seemed delicate and fragile could send such an invitation and what plan she was devising. The Archbishop began the ceremony and asked Jack Saxon if he swore before God to take Grace Taylor as his wife and to cherish and love her for the rest of his life. Jack smiled a cunning smile despite the bruise on his face and answered in the affirmative, confirming his oath. Then the Archbishop directed the same question to Grace, asking her if she swore to take Jack Saxon as her husband and to cherish and love him for the rest of her life. At that moment, Grace remembered Rosette's harsh words advising her to live smiling like a fool. She also recalled an old lesson she had learned from her teacher, who told her that she possessed an excellent weapon and that when hunting prey larger than herself, she must never appear stronger than her opponent. The teacher completed his advice on the necessity of hiding the strategy behind a smile and hiding the fighting spirit within her arms. Once the opponent is completely stripped of his guard, the right moment comes to deliver the final blow. With a confident smile, Grace answered in the negative, declaring that there was someone else she loved. She added that she could not love even a single strand of hair on Jack Saxon. Amidst everyone's shock, she revealed that the person she loved was Duke Walter Richmond, who stood among the audience with a slight smile. Later, Rosette's father was running after Jack Saxon's father and asking her to wait a bit until he found a solution to that problem caused by Grace. Jack Saxon's mother announced loudly that she would not allow this marriage, denouncing how they dared to present a vulgar woman as a bride for her son, and confirmed that the debt exemption had become null and void, then asked her son to leave with her immediately. The new Duke and Duchess Taylor panicked and tried to stop the Saxon family, with the Duke shouting at the guards to prevent the carriage from leaving. Then he directed his words angrily to Grace, wondering where she thought she was going, and calling her name sharply. He threatened her that if she did not return immediately and kneel begging, she would be expelled from the Taylor family. However, Grace turned calmly and began walking away from them toward Duke Richmond. The Duke was watching her as she approached him with a calm smile. She passed by him and then continued her way confidently out of the church, leaving behind the utter chaos. The Duke decided to leave as well. So his companion hurried to him to tell him that Duke Taylor was causing a big scene in the church, having thrown himself in front of the Saxon family's carriage, and asked him if he would not stay to watch. But the Duke answered him calmly that they should go. The Duke explained to his companion that Grace told him she would deliver a sword to him and that he was going now to receive it, which aroused the confusion of his companion, who wondered if they were heading to a weapons dealer. The Duke realized in his heart that the sword Grace referred to in the invitation was none other than herself. She offered to place herself in his hands, pledging to protect his secret. The Duke wondered to himself, thinking of Grace Taylor, what exactly she knew about him. While he was thinking about that, Grace was walking with steady steps in a dark stone corridor, moving away from her past toward a new future. In a secluded place resembling a stone tower, Grace was lying in her wedding dress before a lady wearing black clothes and carrying a lamp appeared, advancing toward her in a dark, circular corridor. That lady was Lady Cornwall, who continued to advance with her lamp. So Grace called her name quietly. Lady Cornwall reached out and took Grace's hand in a clear gesture of support. Then they walked together in the stone hall. When they reached a large wooden door, Lady Cornwall told Grace that everything was ready as planned. Then she bowed her head, saying that the long-waited time had finally come, which Grace confirmed with a calm and steady look. The events returned in memory to the past, where Grace was still a child, addressing Lady Cornwall, noting that this was the moment they had waited 13 years for. Little Grace was asking Lady Cornwall's help in order to reclaim the Taylor house that had been stolen from her. Lady Cornwall guided her and told her that the person she was looking for resided on the top floor of the Maxwell Inn, located in the 4th alley. While Grace was preparing to set off wearing a black cloak, Lady Cornwall reassured her that the maid, Jessie, would follow her directly to provide assistance. The scene moved to Grace sitting in the carriage, contemplating from the window and recalling the events that occurred that day. She remembered the man she passed in the church aisle and how they did not exchange even a single word. Despite that silence, she was able to recognize him immediately. His prestige was so overwhelming that the corridors of the luxurious Taylor Palace faded in his presence to become just a faint background. She realized in her heart that he was that man, the central character who was indispensable in her plan for revenge. Meanwhile, the Duke and his companion arrived at the Maxwell Inn that Lady Cornwall had indicated. The Duke's companion noticed that the place, which was teeming with life in the morning, had become completely empty, leading him to wonder if the inn had stopped working. While the Duke was examining the place quietly, the Duke realized, as he expected, that Grace already knew his location and had cleared the place for them. The Duke went up to his room, and when he was about to enter, he paused for a moment. Then he knocked on the door as a signal for his entry. Realizing she was inside, he opened the door to find Grace already waiting for her. Wearing her black cloak, she was sitting quietly and confidently by the window, waiting for his arrival. Then she rose and held a small dark piece of cloth and presented it to him. The scene moved again to a carriage traveling alone on a desolate road under the cover of darkness. The memory of little Grace went back again when she heard from her father as he was talking about the tragic carriage accident that was said to have claimed the lives of the Duke and Duchess of Richmond, as well as the Crown Prince. She remembered a dialogue that took place about that incident where her mother wondered if the deceased was truly the Crown Prince for the father to answer her that His Highness was likely fine because the Duke of Richmond had taken his measures in advance to protect him from the Empress. They concluded that the body that was found must have been that of the young Duke of Richmond, given the great resemblance he shared with the Crown Prince. The couple commented while wearing mourning clothes on the situation, describing it as tragic and sad. Little Grace woke up in the carriage to the voice of her mother, asking her if she was awake. So, the child asked her anxiously if something had happened. The mother replied that she was the one who woke her up and asked her to sleep a little. She added that the road was still long until reaching the funeral hall, but something sudden happened as the carriage stopped suddenly. The mother, Luciana, embraced her daughter, and Arthur asked them anxiously if they were okay. So Luciana answered him that she was fine and asked him how he was for him to reassure her that he too was fine. Arthur asked Luciana to stay in the carriage while he went to take a quick look at what was going on outside. Arthur went out wondering about the reason for the sudden stop of the carriage and felt that something was wrong. He was surprised by the presence of someone in front of him and soon realized that he was one of the Crown Prince's knights. The knight was severely injured and could barely utter a single word, asking them to flee. Arthur hurried to help him while asking him how he was. The knight warned him of those who are not seen and told him they were coming, pleading with him to get away. Then the knight placed something in Arthur's hand, begging him to take it, and he told him that his highness was under the protection of the great lady of Richmond. Arthur returned to his daughter Grace and gave her the thing he received from the knight and asked her to take it and return with it to Taylor Castle. Grace asked anxiously about the fate of her parents. Her mother reassured her that she and her father would follow her directly and asked her not to worry. Arthur turned to the man who was accompanying them and entrusted him with the care of his daughter Grace, and the man answered him in agreement. The man told the little girl that he would accompany her while tears were streaming from her eyes as she watched her parents walk away. On that dark night, Grace was calling her parents in silence, realizing that she would not see them again. Then the memory turned into a horrific scene of fires devouring everything, and screams filling the place while Grace was standing in mourning clothes. An old woman was comforting Grace while rumors spread that the carriage of the Duke and Duchess of Taylor had completely burned. The conspirators linked the fate of the Taylor to the fate of the Richmonds and the Crown Prince. Grace remembered what happened after that, where a man in the shadow wondered what was going on in the world, and she found herself standing before a mysterious man. The man addressed her, saying that if she did not want to meet her parents' fate, she must live quietly and hold her breath. He asked her if she understood, and the child nodded her head with fear, trembling in her eyes before the image turned into young Grace, standing with firmness and determination. Back to the present in the inn, Grace exchanged silent looks with the Duke. The Duke commented, saying that it seemed she already knew the place of his residence. Grace bowed her head with respect and asked him to forgive her insolence. The Duke sat down while holding the invitation she had sent and asked her if she was the one called the Sharpest Blade. Grace answered with a confident smile, confirming that it was indeed her. The Duke looked at her seriously and asked her what she claimed to know about him, expressing his hope that her answer would be worth the trouble of his long journey. Grace surprised him by revealing her knowledge of his true identity, addressing him by the title, Your Highness, the Crown Prince. The Duke rose from his seat in a state of shock and asked her indignantly what kind of trick this was. The Crown Prince flew into a rage at Grace's audacity, and before he could finish his sentence, Grace knelt before him and presented him with the blood-stained piece of cloth she was carrying. The Crown Prince took it to see that it was a piece of cloth with the emblem of a noble family and realized immediately what it was. Grace began explaining to him how she obtained it, saying she was on her way to the capital with her parents after hearing the news of the Crown Prince's death, and there she encountered a severely injured knight. She added that the knight, before drawing his last breath, left his last words to her parents. Those words carried a great secret, which was that the true Crown Prince was under the protection of the great lady of Richmond, and with a sad tone, Grace added that on that ill-fated day, her parents returned to her as black ashes. Grace raised her head and looked directly at the Crown Prince and offered to be his sword of revenge and for him to use her as he wished, and she swore that she would become his blade until the day he regains his rightful position. While the Crown Prince was contemplating her offer seriously, Grace was waiting for his response with steady eyes. The Crown Prince noticed that her eyes, the color of fresh tree leaves, were inhabited by a burning, calm anger, and realized that this woman possessed strong determination, for she had set fire to the place she was supposed to return to, just like a captain who burns his ship and advances directly toward the enemy. The Crown Prince asked Grace how he could carry a sword like her. Grace presented her plan to him simply, saying he only needs to love her before everyone's eyes and make her his official mistress. She added smilingly to make her his official mistress and take her with him to Richmond. The Crown Prince listened to her plan, then said he wanted to understand the matter clearly. She wants him to play the role of the secret lover, she boldly announced in the church today. Then he approached her and asked why she did not simply ask him for marriage. Grace replied that marriage is a very complicated matter and that all she needs is an acceptable pretext to stay by his side. Grace remembered an old advice that the Crown Prince, if he wanted to regain his position, was in need of Richmond's power, and she completed her plan, saying he also needs the power of the Taylor and offered him to claim it, being the only remaining heir of the Taylor lineage, and with this she will place both families in the palm of his hand. The Crown Prince commented that she makes the matter seem very simple and reminded her that the Taylor house currently lies in the grip of Baron Ronan and his wife, and that she herself is a woman who is almost sold to pay off debts. If she had not spoiled the wedding ceremony and escaped. Grace replied calmly that the true lethality of the blade is not always visible to the eye, and explained that just as he waited for his time in the shadow, she had polished herself to become a weapon worthy of use. The Crown Prince was contemplating her silently as she appeared calm and confident. Then he approached her suddenly and drew her toward him by her neck, asking her to listen well. He told her that he hates highfalutions and that pretending leaves room for error and cracks in the armor. But he added, saying that seeing her freeze at the mere touch of him makes him wonder if she truly possesses the determination of a polished blade. Grace wondered about the meaning of the word determination, then answered that she had engraved that word in her heart hundreds of times daily. Grace recalls her painful memories where she watched her family collapse and the wheat fields burn, and she remembered the day she buried her parents and the threat she received from an unknown shadow. The voice of that shadow was warning her as a terrified little child that if she wanted to avoid her parents' fate, she must live as if she were dead, silent, and invisible. She was feeling resentful toward herself for her helplessness, as she could do nothing but shed tears repeatedly, and wondered if this was the determination she had sworn to herself. In the present, Grace kissed the Crown Prince suddenly, which aroused his surprise. After she moved away from him, she looked at him steadily and asked him if he possessed the determination to proceed with her plan. The Crown Prince admitted that she had hit the mark, noting that a sharply polished blade might sometimes cut the hand of its carrier, but he agreed in the end, asking her to explain her plan to him in detail. He asked her how she intended to use his affection as a Smoko-Kosi screen to take over Richmond, and how she plans to reclaim the Taylor house. The Crown Prince answered himself in his heart that it does not matter if the blade cuts him as long as he can bring his enemies to their knees. Meanwhile, in Taylor Palace, Baron Ronan was angry, cursing the Saxons for demanding immediate debt repayment. He demanded his wife, the Baroness, to hand over all her jewelry, but she refused flatly, reminding him of the effort she made to collect them. The Baron shouted that he did not care, then wondered angrily about the whereabouts of Grace, who had completely disappeared. The Baroness suggested desperately that they sell the palace, and added enthusiastically that the palace is huge, and surely they could sell it to pay off the debt. But the Baron reminded her that the imperial law prevents the private buying and selling of noble estates. At that moment, Lady Cornwall appeared. So the Baroness asked her angrily where she had been hiding until now. So Lady Cornwall apologized, explaining she was late in searching for the documents related to their debts. The Baron ordered her angrily to forget about the documents and go search for Grace and bring her before him immediately. Lady Cornwall advised him calmly to compose himself, noting that Grace's disappearance might actually be a blessing in disguise. The Baron and Baroness denounced her words in surprise. Lady Cornwall explained that the Count Saxon family are relatives of the Empress, and that the scene that occurred at the wedding ceremony is considered an insult to Her Majesty personally, and warned them that if they were not careful, Her Majesty's anger would be directed directly at the Taylor house. The Baron asked anxiously what they should do then. Lady Cornwall suggested they expel Grace from the family, and with this they proved to Her Majesty and the world that the Taylor house has no relationship with her shameful actions, and if Grace alone bears the full blame, she will be destroyed, and she added that Taylor Palace will become entirely theirs. The Baron burst into laughter. Realizing that the gods were on his side and that the duche would finally be his, the Baron ordered Lady Cornwall to deal with the arrangements immediately. So she answered him in agreement, confirming she would take care of everything. In an elegant horse-drawn carriage, Jack Saxon was sitting alone, contemplating what happened at the wedding. He remembered Grace's definitive words that she could never love him. Not even a single strand of hair from his head. Saxon was thinking about the contradiction between what was said to him about Grace, that she was a demure little princess who never set foot outside the castle, and the fact that she was hiding a secret lover all this time, and wondered if she was with him now. Anger flared within him, thinking that he had been pushed to rock bottom while she and that damn one were together, and he vowed that he would find them and threatened that he would cut her love her into pieces before her eyes. Then he wondered coldly if he would see tears streaming from her beautiful eyes. While he was deep in his vengeful thoughts, he whispered her name, Grace Taylor, admitting that he admired even the sound of her name. Meanwhile, in front of the Maxwell Inn, Joseph Rickon, the Crown Prince's assistant, was waiting anxiously, grumbling about the long wait and wondering what was going on inside, as curiosity almost killed him. He noticed that his neck was about to break from looking up so much as he watched. Suddenly, a woman wearing a brown cloak came out. So he wondered to himself about her identity. And with a sharp tone, he asked her who she was and demanded her to identify herself, threatening her. The woman received his threat with sarcasm and disdain and asked him affectionately about what consequences would follow that, and if he intended to stab her, and even incited him to proceed with that which plunged Joseph into confusion and agitation. The woman continued rebuking him, noting that they had not met before, and yet he speaks to her condescendingly. And this is the reason why knights are described as ignorant, which prompted him to change his tone suddenly to politeness, and he asked her, stuttering, about her identity. At that moment, Grace appeared at the top of the stairs and called Jessie. So Jessie knew that her young mistress had arrived. The Crown Prince and Grace descended the stairs together, and he commented that Taylor Castle must be in utter chaos now, and praised Grace for being able to get out safely, but Grace answered him with humility. Then she introduced Jessie to the Crown Prince, explaining that she would stay with her from now on to help her. Jessie stepped forward and introduced herself as the young lady's maid, and Grace added that Jessie is also her teacher who taught her courage. Joseph remembered with surprise that Jessie is the same one who boldly challenged him to stab her. Then the Crown Prince introduced his companion, Joseph Rickon. Grace welcomed him politely, expressing her pleasure to meet him and looking forward to working with him from now on. Joseph was confused by the sudden turn of events. The Crown Prince announced calmly that from this moment on, Lady Grace will accompany him to Richmond as his mistress. Joseph was hit by shock and surprise. So the Crown Prince asked him about the reason for his delay, reminding him that he would drive the carriage and he must move. Joseph demanded a proper explanation, so Grace intervened gently and apologized to him because a prestigious knight like him would have to drive the carriage. Joseph was touched by her kindness and thought to himself what a kind young lady she was, but he denied that strongly, claiming that his original dream was to become a carriage driver. Jessie and the Crown Prince smiled quietly at this situation. The carriage set off, and the Crown Prince was riding a black horse beside it. And during the trip, the Crown Prince heard Jessie's voice asking Grace about her wrist. Grace answered her that her wrist still hurts a little. So Jessie commented that based on the bruises on the young Viscount's face, it seemed she chose a very thick bottle, and she should have chosen one that fits her strength. Joseph remembered the bruises on Jack Saxon's face with shock, and the Crown Prince realized with a hidden smile that those marks were the work of the young lady. Inside the carriage, Jessie was explaining to Grace that when swinging the bottle, the whole arm must be used. Grace replied calmly that the next time she meets that man, she will not settle for just a wine bottle. Jessie took her lady's hand, reminding her that this is just the beginning. Grace called Jessie, and the latter reassured her not to worry. Grace looked out of the carriage window and said she had just taken the first step toward reclaiming that land, and confirmed she will not stop and will not collapse from exhaustion. Jessie took her lady's hand again, agreeing enthusiastically with what Grace said. Then Grace asked her to tell everyone that she had started her move. Jessie replied that she understood. Suddenly, Jessie jumped from the moving carriage, which aroused Joseph's surprise. Joseph wondered in astonishment about the reason for her jumping from the carriage without any protection. The Crown Prince thought that Grace said she was preparing to be a sharp blade, and it seems that was not just empty boasting. Joseph called to the Crown Prince, and he answered him, yes, and the Crown Prince told him that it seems they have prepared and added that there is a welcome party waiting for them. Upon their arrival, they were greeted by a group of knights, and one of them announced His Highness's return. The Crown Prince dismounted from his horse, and he was greeted by one of the knights. The knights noticed Grace's presence and wondered about her identity. The Crown Prince took Grace's hand and ordered them to pay their respects to her, announcing she was his mistress. The knights were hit by surprise. The knights began whispering among themselves about His Highness's mistress and about her being a young lady who seems to have been raised very carefully and how she follows him in such rugged roads, describing her as a loyal romantic. But they added that if she truly loved His Highness, she would have stayed quietly in the palace and that she would surely become a burden on him later. Grace listened to their whispers and thought that these are the Richmond Knights, and they are a troop capable of turning into a combat formation with one command, where the archers surround the perimeter, the duelists advance, and the spearmen support them from behind. And even during rest, none of them let down their guard and their minds never rest. They are the 500 who survived for 10 years in the Wall of Death, where most do not survive for even a year. And the fact they are still alive proves they are the best knights of the empire. While the Crown Prince was watching Grace quietly, Joseph suggested to the Crown Prince that the young lady enter the carriage, believing she might faint from seeing these scary monsters. The Crown Prince rejected Joseph's suggestion and ordered him to leave Grace alone, explaining that it was her own wish to observe the Night Corps closely. He added to himself that from the beginning, instead of fainting, she had the expression of a chess player already. Thinking about the next move, one of the knights approached Grace and introduced himself as Andrew Isaac. Andrew was the youngest of 3 sons of Count Isaac's family. Grace welcomed him kindly, expressing her pleasure at meeting him. Andrew offered her some food, and Grace thanked him, but he felt it was too much for him and offered her the rest, which she politely declined. Grace explained that she had heard he would be driving the carriage tomorrow and that he should eat well, apologizing that an excellent knight like him would have to perform the task of a carriage driver. Andrew enthusiastically denied this, claiming that driving carriages was actually what he loved. The other knights began to tease him, surprised that Andy loved driving carriages, and one of them offered him a job as his carriage driver upon their return. Joseph laughed, so the Crown Prince warned him that of all people he should not be laughing. To which Joseph grumbled that his dream of becoming a carriage driver was supposed to be a secret. One of the knights commented that Andy had become lax in his discipline, while another replied that it wasn't discipline Andy lacked, but that someone had made everyone relax, pointing to Grace, and that even if she were His Highness's mistress, there were still rules. The knights gathered in a state of alert. Winged creatures resembling dragons appeared in the sky, and the Crown Prince said they were finally coming. Grace was fascinated by their sound and commented that she had heard many stories about monsters from her teacher, but this was the first time she had actually seen one. The Crown Prince ordered Grace to follow Andrew and advised her to keep her hood up because they might target her head. He reassured her not to be afraid and that it would be over soon. Andrew guided Grace along the path while the knights moved to face the monsters. The Crown Prince shouted at them to move quickly. The knights began to fight with skill and ferocity. Grace watched them with admiration, realizing that this was the skill of those who had survived for 10 years at the Wall of Death, and the scene was magnificent. But she added to herself that the most magnificent of all was the Crown Prince himself. He looked like the incarnation of the god of war, a god of war who leaves nothing standing wherever he passes. Suddenly, Grace felt something strange as her hood fell. When she looked up, she found a monster above her. The monster grabbed her and flew with her into the sky. "So," Andrew shouted, calling for his lady. Andrew drew his sword and shouted at the monster to let the lady go. Andrew jumped and attacked, cutting the monster's wing. Grace fell from above, and he shouted, calling her name. Andrew jumped and caught her in midair, feeling relieved that he managed to grab her. Andrew wondered in shock as he fell from the top of the cliff. The Crown Prince shouted Andrew and Grace's names with deep concern. Then he ordered his men to bring the rope, announcing that he would go down to save them. At the bottom, Grace woke up first. Grace was anxiously checking Andrew's condition, thinking that he had protected her with his entire body during the fall. She felt his pulse and breathed a sigh of relief because he was still alive. Grace stood up cautiously, realizing that the danger was not yet over. A huge wolf with glowing red eyes appeared from among the trees. The Crown Prince descended by the rope and shouted at Grace to retreat. Grace hesitated for a moment. Then she thought that Andrew would die if she retreated now. With firm determination, she declared that she could not retreat. The Crown Prince looked at her angrily and called her a fool. Grace was desperately searching for anything that could help her protect Andrew. She found a bow and arrows on the ground. She grabbed the bow and aimed it at the wolf. She was luring it to come closer and closer. When it was close enough, she fired the arrow. Then she fired another arrow, but she suddenly realized that she didn't have enough strength to pull the bow again. Death was approaching her rapidly. Suddenly, the Crown Prince appeared behind her, placed his hand on hers, and ordered her not to let go of the bow. He gave her a sharp look. Grace felt that the shadow of death that had been looming over her had vanished in his presence. That darkness was dissipated by a more intense darkness surrounding this man. The Crown Prince helped her release the arrow, which flew powerfully and hit the wolf. The wolf fell wounded. The Crown Prince checked on Grace and noticed that the gargoyle's claws had fortunately only pierced her cloak. He asked her if she was okay, and she calmly answered in the affirmative. Meanwhile, one of the knights was scolding Andrew for still being on the ground, while another knight asked him to calm down. Another knight carried Andrew on his back, grumbling that he caused too much trouble. Then he thanked Grace for saving his brother. Grace asked him anxiously about Sir Andrew's condition, and his brother reassured her that it was not serious. Then he told her that they would go up first and asked her to climb up carefully. The Crown Prince was watching the situation, thinking that Grace had not been seriously injured by the gargoyle, but she must be suffering from bruises everywhere and a scratch on her arm from the bowering. He asked Grace if she could climb. She looked at him steadily. Then she extended her hand in front of him. So he asked her in surprise what she was doing. Grace reminded him that he had said he was not the type to pretend anything. The Crown Prince thought that since their first meeting, he felt she had been planning this for a very long time, and that it was impossible for her to be this calm otherwise. Then he carried her in his arms and told her to hold on to him tightly. Grace thanked him quietly. In another place, an angry man was talking about the failure of another assassination attempt, wondering how many assassins they had sent over the past 10 years to kill that man. A woman tried to calm him down, reminding him that it wasn't over yet, but he insisted on the necessity of getting rid of him to return the Duce to Henry Linco, expressing his despair that he wouldn't die. The man recalled in his memory how the Duke and his knights went to the Wall of Death at the age of 13, and how 10 long years had passed since then, and that he had never learned the etiquette of noble society or the dignity of a duke, and had never appeared at any social occasion. He wondered who had stayed by his side all this time, asserting that the master of the castle was him, Henry Linco. And he declared that Walter Richmond would never take over this castle and that he would be treated like his grandmother left to rot in the annex. In a dark room, a maid was talking to an old woman. The maid was telling her that the Duke would finally return after 10 years. The maid asked her how she would receive His Highness, and that upon his return, even Marquis Linco and his wife would not dare to do anything. The old woman replied that she was sleepy and asked that no one wake her up. She thought that nothing mattered, neither family nor honor, nothing at all. The Crown Prince and Grace finally arrived at the vast Richmond castle. Grace looked at the castle calmly. The Crown Prince told her that she had finally gotten rid of her bodyguard, but she didn't understand what he meant. He asked her to look behind her, and she saw the knights presenting her with gifts, from a small kitten to medicinal herbs and flowers. The Crown Prince explained that these were the Knights of Richmond, and Grace remembered that she had said she would win them over no matter what it cost. The Crown Prince thought that what he had earned with difficulty by waving his sword for 10 years she had obtained in just a few days. The Crown Prince thought to himself that what Grace did was not the result of a few days, but the fruit of long years of honing herself to become his blade. The Crown Prince asked her if she was afraid. Grace responded sarcastically, wondering if he was the one who was afraid, and answered him, "Of course not." She added that she had been waiting for this moment alone. The Crown Prince agreed with her and thought of the pack of lynxes pretending to be blue eagles and that he must give them an end befitting them. Then Grace asked him to call her Grace from now on, since they were lovers, and he should call her with more affection. The Crown Prince wondered about the words love and affection. He thought that these words did not suit someone who had survived for 10 years with revenge as his only goal in life. He added to himself that she was no different from him. So how could she talk about love and affection so easily? She added that it would be annoying if even this was difficult for him, and that she had no intention of taking anything lightly either. The Crown Prince stepped toward her, took her hand and kissed it gently. He called her by her name as she requested, and told her that he would seat her on his horse so they could enter Richmond Castle together. He asked her if even that was difficult for her, to which she replied in the negative and called him Walter. The sounds of trumpets blared, announcing the return of the Duke of Richmond, Lord of the Tybex Mountains and the Urutu River, protector of the Northwest and the Rock of the Deacon Empire. The Duke and his knights entered the castle. Grace noticed the presence of Marquis and Marchioness Linko, the Crown Prince, assured her that they could be recognized at a single glance. Grace added that someone who had lived among thieves could not mistake them, for thieves are naturally imputed. The Crown Prince helped Grace down from the horse's back. The Mayoress and Marchioness were surprised by Grace's presence. The Marchioness welcomed His Highness's return. The Crown Prince agreed. The Marchioness told the Crown Prince that she was not aware he had a guest, and offered to accompany the lady to the drawing room, noting that the guest rooms might not be sufficiently prepared as they hadn't received word of their arrival. The Crown Prince refused. He announced that from now on, Grace would reside in the chandelier room. The Marchioness was shocked. She stammered at that room, but the Crown Prince interrupted her, asking the reason for her shock. The Crown Prince wondered coldly in his own palace if he needed permission. The Marchioness stammered in the negative. Then the Crown Prince declared that the welcome had gone on long enough and ordered everyone to leave. The Crown Prince told Grace that they should go too. They exchanged calm glances. Then he took her hand. They walked together up the stairs while the servants' gazes followed them. Marquilo wondered about the identity of the woman the Crown Prince had brought with him. The servants began to whisper, surprised that he hadn't even introduced her, yet intended to place her in the Grand Duchess's suites, wondering if he thought he could ignore his followers in such a way. The Marquis thought that Walter Richmond was trying to assert that he was the master here. He spoke to one of his men, saying that the Duke seemed to be planning something, but reassured him that things would not go as planned. Then he ordered everyone to gather in the meeting room immediately. The Marquis emphasized that even if he were the Duke of Richmond, Richmond's properties were currently in the palm of his hand. In another place, a young girl with pink hair was wondering what was happening, calling out for Walter. Later, the servants came out after they finished serving the Crown Prince and Grace. The Crown Prince gently let go of Grace's hand. Grace entered the chandelier room and found it luxurious and tidy, with a fire burning in the fireplace and a soft bed. She noticed the presence of fresh lilies, clearly replaced this morning, which meant that someone had been using this room all along and intended to sleep here tonight as well. Grace thought that person was using what did not belong to them and had the audacity to get angry when it was reclaimed. The Crown Prince asked her about that performance and how long she had practiced it. Grace wondered which acting he was talking about, to which he replied, asking about that pretentious performance full of love. Then she calmly answered that it wasn't practice. She explained that she simply convinces herself at that moment that she has truly fallen in love. The Crown Prince asked her if it was that simple, and she replied that it wasn't difficult at all. Then she decided to address him as Your Highness from now on, because they didn't know who might be listening. She commented with a smile that he was very convincing in persuading himself as well, and that his performance made it easier for her to act. He replied that the feeling was mutual. Grace noticed that she did not see the Grand Lady. The Crown Prince told her she was likely in the annex, so Grace asked about its location. The Crown Prince's memory returned to his grandmother, calling her name. He remembered how he said goodbye to her as a child, promising her that he would return soon. The grandmother was sitting alone, wondering where Walter was, and the young Crown Prince answered her. In a distant memory, the grandmother was addressing the Crown Prince, wondering to herself why her grandson was wearing Walter's clothes. Thinking about it, she also wondered why Walter was wearing the Crown Prince's clothes. Then she realized the bitter truth and told him he was not Walter, demanding that he return to her. In the present, one of the maids was addressing the Grand Lady in the annex. She told her that the Duke had returned and that the young lady he brought with him had requested to meet her. Grace was sipping tea in another room and asked Jessie if anyone had followed them to the annex. Jessie replied that there was one person, but he was such a novice that she thought he wanted to be caught. So Grace concluded that they didn't see the need to waste a professional spy on her. Grace thought that they saw her as just a woman Walter Richmond had brought suddenly, a man who had left high society 10 years ago to stay at the Wall of Death, and that she knew exactly how the people of Richmond Castle would judge her. They would describe her as a fallen noble trying to seduce the Duke, or a commoner pretending to be a noble, a woman who would soon be kicked out and wasn't even worth the trouble of attention. She realized that this disregard was exactly what she needed now. Lady Isaac entered and told Grace that she enjoyed the tea. Lady Isaac informed Grace that the Grand Lady had refused to see her. Lady Isaac asked her to leave, so Grace asked if she had announced her as the young lady the Duke brought with him. Lady Isaac admitted to that. So Grace ordered her to go back and do it properly. She ordered her to tell her that Grace from the house of Duke Taylor requests to meet her. Lady Isaac remembered the status of the Grand Lady Eliza Deacon, who was born of the Deacon imperial bloodline and married into the house of Richmond to become the Grand Lady Eliza Richmond. She held the noblest title in the Deacon Empire, and the people of the empire called her the Queen of Richmond. But all of that was in the past. Lady Isaac remembered how Marionesses Ringo treated the Grand Lady Crewy, taking away her maids and reducing her firewood rations, and how she ignored the Grand Lady's complaints about the cold, claiming that she was in a position that forced her to save every piece of wood. She asked everyone to endure for the sake of Richmond. Back in the annex, the Grand Lady asked sharply, "What did you say?" Lady Isaac repeated, "Taylor?" And the Grand Lady answered, "Yes." The Grand Lady asked if that child was the young lady, and Lady Isaac confirmed that she was a young lady with blonde hair and light green eyes. The Grand Lady concluded that she must be of the lineage of the former Duke Taylor. Lady Isaac asked if she would meet her. After a silence, the Grand Lady asked if the Duke had said he brought her here, and Lady Isaac answered yes. The Grand Lady ordered them to be told to return. Then she called her lady-in-waiting, Arwen, and told her she had done enough and that she should return to her family. She added that her sons had returned as well. She asked her to stop serving her as a lady-in-waiting. Arwen, Lady Isaac, bowed respectfully and asked the Grand Lady to rest. She promised her that she would go to deliver her words. Arwen returned to Grace and apologized, saying that the Grand Lady still refused to meet her. Arwen asked Grace to leave, so Grace apologized to her for the disturbance and left. Jessie asked her mistress what should be done, emphasizing that the Grand Lady's cooperation was absolutely necessary. Grace asked Jessie to return to the chandelier room first, and on her way observe the movements of the servants and the atmosphere of the castle beforehand. While Jessie was asking about her mistress's plan after the failure of the plan to win over the Grand Lady, Grace answered her that her plan had not failed yet. Grace went to the e-kitchen, where Arwen was cleaning herself, and asked her why she was doing all this cleaning personally. She added in astonishment why there wasn't a single maid and why she was the only lady in waiting. Arwen reminded her that the Grand Lady had ordered her to leave, but Grace drew her attention to the fact that the grass in the garden had been cut in a hurry today, and that the smell of raw greenery filled everywhere, asking her how everything here was usually maintained. She added that while the main residence was warm, the annex was full of cold air, as if there wasn't a single piece of firewood for the stove. She wondered angrily why the Queen of Richmond was being treated this way. Arwen sighed and asked her to leave. Grace called out to Lady Isaac and asked her what she felt while watching her mistress being treated this way. She asked her what she wanted to do. She wondered if she wasn't waiting for an opportunity to return her to her rightful place. Grace explained that she too had prepared herself in Taylor, enduring years no different from being a living corpse, and that she was sure His Highness was the same. Arwen asked her what she had prepared. Grace replied that she prepared revenge. She called out to her and told her that the time had come to return Richmond to its queen. Arwen remembered the Grand Lady when she was in her power. Arwen shouted, and Grace asked her to help her wake the Grand Lady and help her reclaim Richmond. Arwen promised that if she could wake her and return Richmond to her, she would even give her life gladly. Arwen Isaac, the woman who always stood by the Queen of Richmond. Grace realized that her path to reclaiming Richmond began with gaining a strong ally, and none was more important than Lady Arwen Isaac. For Lady Isaac was not just the wife of Count Isaac, she was the most trusted figure to the former Duke of Richmond, and the only woman capable of rallying countless noble families to serve Richmond's cause with a single word from her. For this reason, winning her to her side was a top priority, even before winning over the Grand Lady Eliza herself. Indeed, Grace extended her hand, saying she looked forward to working with her. Meanwhile, in Marquis Linco's palace, anger was smoldering. The Marquis issued his strict orders to his men to search for everything related to that mysterious woman who appeared suddenly, and ordered them to comb every inch of the area near the Wall of Death, the place where the Duke had been isolated for 10 full years. His wife, the Marchioness, shared his disgust, wondering sarcastically how those living in such a place could be called nobles, and how the Duke dared to grant a woman like her the prestigious chandelier room. The Marquis considered this act a direct insult to him and his family, wondering aloud who had protected Richmond throughout those difficult years. It seemed clear that the Duke and his companions had forgotten that Richmond did not belong to the Duke alone. With cold determination, the Marquis decided that he would remind them himself. While the Marchioness would work on destabilizing the Duke as well, far from these intrigues, Lady Flora Lowen, the Count's daughter, was immersed in daydreams. She remembered Walter Richmond. She had always imagined knights as crude, coarse, and brutal men. But he was completely different in her eyes. She imagined herself standing by his side and how they would look together as a perfect couple. But the image of Grace walking beside the Duke shattered her rosy dream, and her delicate features turned into a mask of anger and jealousy. Her maids rushed to her immediately, calling her name with concern. The maids began to whisper the news they had received about that woman. Flora asked them with feigned eagerness what kind of story they had heard. The maids told her that Martinez Linco had ordered a thorough investigation in the area near the Wall of Death to reveal that woman's identity, and it turned out that her origins were very humble. Flora was surprised with feigned shock, wondering how she could come from that place full of criminals and monsters. The maids continued spreading rumors, saying she must have begged the Duke for the chandelier room and that she only had one maid, and even seemed to have a strange smell. Flora pretended to be deeply saddened, expressing how much sorrow the former duchesses would feel if they knew a woman like her was occupying that room. The maids praised their mistress's tender heart, describing her as a true angel who worries about the former duchesses, even in such a situation. With an innocent smile, Flora gave them some coins and asked them to tell her anything new they learned. The maids thanked her and promised to investigate every detail. After they left, Flora's look changed completely, and she thought that whoever stood beside the Duke of Richmond must be someone worthy of this reputation. Coldly, she decided that that woman must not become too attached to this palace. In the Duke's office, Walter was reviewing some papers quietly. His assistant, Joseph, interrupted him, wondering why he was slowing down and reminding him of their original plan to move immediately upon their arrival before their enemies had time to prepare. The Duke responded with a quiet question as to whether he lacked confidence if their opponents were prepared. Joseph denied it hesitantly. So the Duke asked him directly, "What is it, Joseph?" Joseph told his master, the Crown Prince, that the knights of the subsidiary families had come to pledge loyalty, but Count Lowen had turned them away rudely at the main gate. Returning to that incident, the head of the House of Rodeo, a venerable man who had served the Richmond family for generations, stood declaring that he came to pay respect to his master, but was met with senseless rudeness. The Count Lowenson asked him with a smug smile if he intended to enter the main castle in his shabby state. When the old knight was incensed with anger, the young man told him with provocative calmness that this was a message from Marchioness Linko. The message was very insulting, describing his thief-like appearance as a disgrace to Richmond's honor. The Marchioness continued in her sarcastic message, wondering if scars weren't medals earned on the battlefield, and asserting that the knight's true place lies outside this gate, and that the true loyalty they must show is waiting wherever there is a need for them. Before, the Count's son ordered him to leave immediately if he had understood the message. To him, these were just uninvited guests who had seized his home. In fact, the Crown Prince's intention upon his return to Richmond was to purge them all without any delay. He planned not to leave any of them, and to eliminate them all down to the last individual. But he remembered Grace's wise words, warning him against polluting Richmond with blood. She explained to him that if Richmond were seized by shedding blood, its legitimacy in the eyes of the people would collapse, and from that moment, even justified force would be condemned as rebellion. The Crown Prince reflected on the bitter irony. Thieves are free to loot as they wish. While the rightful owner must remain calm and maintain his dignity, he asked Grace if what she was saying was that he was obliged to solve everything through the proper channels, commenting on her amazing way of making. The most complex matters seemed simple. Grace admitted that it wasn't simple at all. But she emphasized that for this very reason, and because it is difficult, it is the right thing to do. Her advice to take the righteous path was still echoing in his mind. The Crown Prince ordered Joseph to wait a little longer. He explained to him that over the past 10 years, his enemies must believe he was wasting his time. But in that time, he gained a loyal ally like him. He added that since he had waited 10 years, he could certainly wait a few more days. Joseph agreed, of course. So the Crown Prince presented him with a document expressing his satisfaction. At that moment, someone announced that Marchioness Linko requested to meet him and that Lady Flora of the House of Lowen also requested to meet him. After a moment of thought, the Crown Prince simply ordered them to be let in. In the reception room, the Marchioness welcomed the Crown Prince's return once again, and he thanked her quietly. Then she introduced Flora to him, describing her as the precious only daughter of the family of Count Lowen, the loyal followers of Richmond, and that she cherishes her as her own daughter. The Marchioness continued praising her, saying that she possesses a sophisticated character that matches her beauty, and that she honed her talents in embroidery, music, and painting. Flora noticed the Crown Prince looking at her and pretended to be embarrassed, while the Marchioness emphasized that there would be no other young lady as distinguished as her in appearance and substance. Before the Marchioness could finish her speech, the Crown Prince interrupted her with a direct question as to what brought them here. He pointed out that they didn't come just to repeat the welcome they had already offered at the gate. So the Marchioness answered him with a cunning smile that his first return after 10 years is not enough, and that many in the inner court wished to speak with him at length. The Marchioness continued her cunning speech, explaining that many in the court wished to speak with him, especially regarding the guest he brought with him. She asked the Crown Prince quietly, pretending not to understand about the identity of that figure she meant. The Crown Prince answered clearly and without hesitation, declaring that her name is Grace and that she is his lover. The Marchioness and Flora exchanged a meaningful look. They already knew she was his lover. But what truly mattered was what his name revealed to her, Grace only, without any family title. This was a confirmation of her suspicions. As she expected, that woman was of lowly origins. Based on this conclusion, the Marchioness addressed the Crown Prince directly, asking him to forgive her boldness, but she stressed that he should not grant the chandelier room based on personal emotion. She explained that this room is the room of the Grand Lady of Richmond, whom everyone revere, and that even among the noblest of nobles, only those who have been thoroughly vetted are allowed to stay there. This is the status that room represents, the Crown Prince interrupted her with icy calmness, called her by her title Marchioness, then suddenly asked her what his name was. The Marchioness was confused for a moment, so he ordered her in a tone that allowed no argument not to make him ask again. At that moment, the Marchioness felt a massive pressure she had never felt before, an aura of absolute authority that almost made her kneel, as if she were in the presence of royal blood. But she soon gathered herself, convincing herself that this was impossible, for the Crown Prince had died burnt with the former Duke and Duchess, and that the current Duke was only trying to intimidate her. After she regained her composure, the Marchioness offered her apology, but she added that the position of Duchess requires gaining the respect of the noble women and maids in the inner court. She warned that if an unworthy figure remained by his side, it would deal a fatal blow to his honor and Richmond's dignity alike. Then she presented the solution, declaring that the woman most suitable for him here in Richmond is Flora, who stands before him. She ended her speech asserting that this is sincere advice she offers for the sake of Richmond and trusts he will listen to it. The Crown Prince was listening to her quietly. While other thoughts were going through his mind entirely, he thought that after she conspired with the Empress to push him to the wall of death, she now dares to say this. He remembered the documents he had reviewed earlier, which clearly showed that most of the Torito's income was flowing directly into the pockets of the Martians' faction, and the fact that she didn't bother to hide the records meant she completely underestimated him and considered him a fool. He looked at her greedy gaze and decided to himself that he would exploit this greed completely. With total coldness, the Crown Prince answered that he understood exactly what she meant, then authorized them to leave. The Marchioness left feeling angry at his style. Thinking to herself that whether the Duke was pretending to be strong or not, the ones who truly move Richmond in the end are House Rinko. She whispered to Flora that the Duke's look at her was far from ordinary. So Flora pretended to be shy, but emphasized happily that the Duke had smiled at her in the end, just as she expected. The Marchioness thought that in a desolate place, his heart might lean toward a woman without a title, but the look changes as the environment changes. She wondered how that woman managed to imitate nobles with such skill, realizing that there are countless commoners who try desperately to rise. But in the end, the real and the fake can never be the same. Then she ordered Flora to make frequent visits to the Duke, carrying with her the dignity of a duchess to show them that she is different by birth from those women who pretend to be elegant. Flora answered enthusiastically that she would do her best to be a help to His Highness's honor. But before they left, they noticed Grace approaching them. The Marchioness and Flora glared sharply at Grace. Then the Marchioness continued pouring her toxic advice onto Flora, ordering her to engrave into her heart the fact that if a woman of unknown origin remained by the Duke's side, no one would ever respect him. Grace and the Marchioness's gazes met, and the latter wondered sarcastically whether that woman would be good at playing the role of a noble. Grace stepped forward calmly and confidently, passing her without speaking. But the Martian stopped her with an arrogant look. With a loud voice full of contempt, the Marchioness shouted in her face, wondering how she dared not bow her head before her. She continued her screaming, ordering her to leave immediately if she had any ounce of shame. She declared that this castle of the Duke of Richmond is not a place where even a single strand of hair from the likes of her is allowed to enter. With a cold smile, Grace commented on the situation, considering it funny to see a thief preaching about shame. Then she turned calmly and asked the Marchioness if she knew who she was. Flora answered with blind confidence that she knew, of course, and that those like her could distinguish the lowly from the noble just by feeling. Grace replied sarcastically that she was understanding after this stinging response. The Marchioness declared that if she did not intend to leave on her own, she would make her want to. The Marchioness called for the guards, and one of the maids rushed to her. The Marchioness issued her strict order to cut off all forms of support for the chandelier room from this moment forward. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince was in his office reflecting on the events. Realizing that a long time had already passed, he wondered to himself if Grace was still in the annex. He remembered her words about love and how at that moment she had convinced herself that she had truly fallen in love. And it wasn't something she had practiced beforehand. She had told him to take her and use her as he pleased, but now he realized that he was the one who must hold himself together so as not to be the one being used. At that moment, a mysterious person appeared in the room. The Crown Prince ordered Joseph to examine him. Joseph drew his sword and asked the intruder about his identity, threatening him to reveal himself. The intruder replied defiantly, wondering what would happen if he didn't. Sarcastically, he asked if Joseph was going to stab him. Joseph felt that he had heard this tone before. The Crown Prince ordered Joseph to lower his sword, and he obeyed immediately. Then the Crown Prince asked the new guest if Grace had sent him. The guest noticed that the Crown Prince said Grace, and not the young lady. Suddenly, Grace appeared at the door, calling the name Eric, and welcomed him warmly. Eric bowed before her respectfully, kissing her hand as he addressed her with the title, My Lady, which aroused the Crown Prince's surprise. Grace explained that Eric is Viscount Eric Napier, one of the loyal followers of the Taylor family who currently manages a merchant guild under a false identity. Eric presented himself politely, apologizing for his previous rudeness. The Crown Prince replied that he forgives the rudeness of his assistant Joseph as well because he felt an unexpected presence. The Crown Prince thought to himself that Eric was looking at him as if he were going to tear him to pieces. The Crown Prince asked Grace about her visit to the annex. She told him that she had met Lady Isaac and that she had agreed to help. Grace added confidently that the Grand Lady would wake up soon as well. After that, the Crown Prince advised her to rest, and she politely agreed. After she left, the Crown Prince ordered Joseph to remain on alert and help the Viscount to leave without being noticed. Once he was alone, the Crown Prince's thoughts sank into painful memories of his grandmother and how she was warm and affectionate. He remembered her muffled crying that made him realize whether he liked it or not that merely breathing and living could be a sin. In her eyes, he was a sinner who survived in exchange for the life of the real heir of Richmond. While he was lost in these thoughts, Lady Isaac announced that His Highness had arrived. The Crown Prince realized that in his grandmother's eyes he was nothing but a criminal who stole even her grandson's name. The Crown Prince entered his grandmother's room and noticed that everything remained exactly as it was 10 years ago, even the furniture arrangement. The only thing that changed was his grandmother, who had become thin and weak. He wondered to himself what she had been doing all this time while the rats were wreaking havoc in Richmond Castle. He added that punishing the followers of Richmond should be her task, not his. He called out to her, calling her grandmother. Feeling a mixture of sadness and anger, he realized that in reality, the person his grandmother wanted to punish more than anyone else was not the Marquise and Marchioness Ringo, but himself. Elsewhere, Marioness Ringo was throwing silver spoons on the floor in anger, screaming how a dirty, lowly girl dared to act with such arrogance. She asked one of her assistants anxiously what had happened to the request they sent to the Red Moon organization. The assistant replied hesitantly that they said it would take 3 months. The Marchioness was enraged by this response. The assistant quickly added that they added a note to the report. She explained that the absence of a family name complicates the investigation and that they asked for her patience. The head of the Red Moon organization was reflecting on the matter and thought that even commoners usually possess a surname, and not having one at all indicates that her parents or she herself must be criminals. The Marchioness concluded that the word criminal suited her perfectly. Near the Wall of Death lies the village of fugitives, a sanctuary for heinous criminals who have violated imperial law. The head of the Red Moon organization added, explaining to the Marchioness through the maid that fraud or theft are not considered significant crimes in the village of fugitives. They are the type who might kill just for missing a meal. The Marchioness was surprised, wondering if it was possible that Grace had killed someone. But she did not rule it out, and that it was entirely possible. And the fact that she seduced the Duke proves that she is not just an ordinary rogue. Rather, she may have committed a crime more heinous than murder, like being one of the Invials. The Marchioness's anger flared as she thought of that foolish Duke who granted the noble Grand Duchess's room to an impudent criminal. The Marchioness realized that with this information she could get rid of both of them with one blow. The Marchioness thought that that rogue might claim innocence or try to prove her identity. But in the end, the inner castle of Richmond is in her grip. She vowed to Walter Richmond and his impudent rogue that she would destroy them completely as she planned. In another room, Grace was reviewing some documents with Eric. Eric asked her if she was satisfied with the results, and she replied that he should not ask about her satisfaction, but rather should demand a reward for such returns. Eric asked if she would give him anything he requested, and she confirmed that to him, of course. Grace explained that this was the result of his achievement in the end, but he replied humbly that he only followed her orders. Eric remembered the day of his father's death and how little Grace comforted him when he was a small child. He remembered how little Grace told him not to cry, and she promised him that once they took revenge on the enemy who slaughtered their families, he could cry with his head held high. Eric recalled how his life was ashes after his father's death until Grace approached him, carrying with her the light of a new, vibrant bud. Since that day, he began to execute her orders and do everything necessary and stop crying before his father's grave. He took the money she entrusted to him and built a huge merchant guild, even if it meant he rarely saw her. For Eric, it was worth the effort. Eric reflected on his lady's plan and how her marriage was a necessary step to restore the name of Taylor. He thought it was good and that all of this was part of her plan. But he wondered to himself if she one day became someone else's property and never returned to their side. Would he still be able to say he was okay? Grace interrupted him from his thoughts. Calling his name, she asked him if a 50% share of the net profit was enough. Eric answered in the negative, not because it wasn't enough. He wondered about the reason for her insistence on giving him a fixed percentage, explaining that this profit resulted from her capital and his hard work, and it's natural to share it, but it belongs to her, and therefore his hard work belongs to her too. Grace told him that she was doing that exactly because she wanted to properly appreciate her people's efforts. Eric asked her about her arrangement with the Duke of Richmond and whether it would end the moment she regains the name of Taylor. Grace replied, of course, confirming that she would return as Duchess Taylor, and His Highness would return to his rightful place. Eric answered that he understood. Suddenly, Joseph entered in panic, announcing that someone was approaching the chandelier room. Eric told his lady Grace to be careful. Someone from the Marchioness's faction had commissioned the Red Moon organization to investigate her identity. Eric explained that they suspected her of being a commoner and that he managed to gain about 3 months of time for them, and also leaked a rumor that she might be from the village of fugitives. After that, Jesse guided Eric to the exit, but Eric suddenly changed direction toward the balcony. Eric asked Jesse to take care of the young lady, then jumped from the balcony with all grace. Joseph and Jesse looked down in surprise, and Eric landed lightly on the ground. Joseph wondered about the type of training they underwent, and Jesse answered him that it was hunter's training. Jesse ordered her lady to hurry to the office and hide the papers while she pretended to be reading. She revealed that the 2 maids who served her dinner yesterday had been imprisoned and assaulted inside the castle. Since the incident occurred after they served her, She suspected that they were trying to pin the charge on her. She concluded that they, before questioning her status, would try to frame him with false accusations first. The Crown Prince asked her if she would be okay. Grace grabbed a chest piece and revealed her plan, saying that she was bait from the beginning. She added that it would be annoying, in fact, if they didn't swallow the bait for in this way, and while they are busy with her, he would be able to move freely. Grace smiled confidently while the Crown Prince looked at her with admiration. Then he confirmed to her that he wouldn't stand idly by. Rather, he would be busy as well in implementing their plans. Elsewhere in the palace, the Marchioness was adorning herself, while one of the ladies praised her, saying she looks very beautiful. One of the ladies continued her compliments to the Marchioness, saying that the late duchesses used to wear this necklace a lot, but she believes it finally found its true owner. The Marchioness pretended to be humble, while Flora added that her mother was right, and that the Marchioness truly looked like a queen with this necklace. The Marchioness burst out laughing with happiness. The Marchioness praised Flora's mother for raising her daughter well, so Flora's mother thanked her for appreciating her as her daughter. The Marchioness asked Flora to sit beside her. Then she offered her a collection of precious jewelry from the Blue Room and asked her which one she preferred. She promised her that she would give her one. Flora was surprised by this generosity, but her mother intervened, saying that this is a very precious gift. So the Marchioness replied that she had always wanted to give Flora one. The Marchioness explained that the Blue Room is full of jewelry collected by generations of Richmond duchesses, and that they do not just represent a material value, but are symbols of power and prestige. For this reason, as soon as Eliza Richmond retired to the annex, she seized the keys to the Blue Room. With these keys, she can control the women of the inner court. Flora's mother asked the Marchioness to choose something suitable for her daughter, relying on her fine taste. Flora agreed and asked her to enlighten them with her excellent taste. The Marchioness chose a pink necklace, saying it would perfectly match the color of Flora's eyes and hair. She insisted on putting it on her herself. The Marchioness explained that the reason for giving her this necklace was to announce her presence to the inner court noble women. Flora thanked her, considering this a great honor for her. The Marchioness asserted with confidence that everyone would understand the message clearly with this necklace. She thought to herself that she, Emily Linco, is the one who has the power to choose the next duchess. The Marchioness praised Flora's beauty after wearing the necklace, so Flora thanked her, attributing the credit to her good choice. Then Flora turned toward the two maids who served Grace's dinner and asked them for their opinion. The two maids praised her appearance, so Flora added sarcastically that that woman cannot dream of something like this. Then she asked them if they had seen any jewelry in Grace's room, and they replied in the negative. Flora pretended to be sympathetic, saying that she made them serve dinner in the chandelier room yesterday and that she appreciated their hard work. At that moment, the maids remembered the threat they received of being killed if they spoke and how serving a lowly person was a very difficult matter. The maids burst into tears, begging the Marchioness to help them, expressing how terrified they were. They revealed that last night after dinner, someone dragged them and hit them and threatened them with being killed if they told anyone. They added that staying silent is also terrifying. The Marchioness pretended to be sympathetic and embraced the two maids, saying that all the children in this castle are like her children. With a cunning smile, she reassured them not to worry and that she would solve everything for them. In another nightmare, the Crown Prince was recalling the moments that changed his life forever. He saw himself as a small child receiving the order to live from now on under the name Walter Richmond. That was the only way to survive with his life. He listened to the cheers echoing "Long live the Duke of Richmond," while he felt lost and confused. But he stopped before the real Walter, who cheered for him too. He was calling Walter in despair. He felt confused, for he knew that the person before him was the real Walter. He wondered in his own heart about his true identity. In the depth of his despair, he heard a voice calling him and ordering him to rise. Grace's voice was echoing in his mind, reminding him that he was her anchor and guide for a long time and that she was able to endure because of him. So he had to rise as well. She was calling him in his dream by his real name, which is Aries. Before he woke up suddenly and described this dream as strange.